Thank you, everybody, for attending this talk. My name is Matt Fisher, and I'm a lead engineer of video playback at Vimeo. Today, I want to talk in some detail around playback metrics, and more importantly, why we consider playback metrics so important to our business and the success of our product. So just some background for those of you who aren't familiar. Vimeo is really the home of a creator tools platform. We pride ourselves on the ability to deliver a product that our creators can use how they wish and provide them with as many tools as possible to enable them to do so. With that, from an engineering perspective, comes a lot of intricate details that we may or may not be savvy to. As those conditions continue to grow, it becomes harder and harder to understand where to devote our time to debug issues, identify issues, and more importantly, ensure the stability and success of our product. So I'll make it clear right now, video playback metrics aren't the end-all be-all solution to this, but what I think a lot of people really need to understand is how important they are as a tool to really provide a clear insight as to what the health and stability of your platform is at any given point in time. So I want to start off with a quick overview of the state of playback metrics, because in reality, it's a little bit convoluted. And the more you can understand around the state, the more you can understand around unique predicaments that each business is put in and different ideas and solutions that can be presented in order to facilitate what the business or product needs really are. So as an engineer, one of the things that, especially a video engineer, one of the things that a lot of us really look to is standardization. From a browser perspective, from a platform perspective, standardization is a very helpful tool in order to identify the quickest path to the most reasonable solution. But in order to understand what needs to be standardized, or if there is standards, we really want to know what is the best option for us to track. Like what events, what properties, what information do we really want to track? And that might be dependent on the business. When you start tracking playback metrics, you'll quickly realize that you'll be storing a copious amount of data. The larger your platform and the more viewers that are consuming content on your platform, the more data you'll be harvesting. And depending on how you allocate, store, aggregate, and surface that data will, again, quickly lead to a proposition that data storage and allocation is almost as important as implementing playback metrics themselves. Even with the data stored in its most raw format or in aggregate form, the initial question is really, what do I do with this data? Looking at it from high-level perspectives, it can be helpful, but it can also be time-consuming. It may not reveal any identifiable issues, and it may hide potential issues that would be discovered after digging down a couple levels. But without a quick understanding of what needs to be broken out and how to dig into that data, again, you can quickly find yourself into a unique black hole that does not necessarily contribute to time well used. So with all of this, with all these questions, with all of these statements, again, the idea is what options are really available to me? And in reality, there's two options, at least from my perspective. The one option is doing this all yourself and rolling your own dice, figuring out what works best for you, what works best for the company, what works best for the employees. And by employees, I mean not just engineers, but potentially everybody in the company. I can speak on this a little bit more, but we really pride ourselves on the ability in Vimeo to surface this data to whoever has questions that it can yield answers to. So not necessarily creating a black box around data, but providing a tool set and availability of that data to allow anybody to answer questions themselves. But the second option is really finding a solution that's based on a third-party platform. Because a lot of these questions don't necessarily have definitive answers, utilizing third-party platforms can be extremely helpful because it'll allow you to get off the ground very, very quickly. It provides a third-party-esque standard where the platform that you choose to use has put in the effort and the time to understand and document and outline exactly what they're storing, how they're storing it, and how they'll surface it to you. It generally comes with a couple caveats in that what's being stored and served to you is you're at the mercy of the company that you're dealing with, and that may be beneficial or it might not be depending on how you want to utilize that data. Again, we utilize data from Playback metrics at Vimeo in a unique circumstance in that we'd like to tie it together with other forms of data that is delivered from back-end services or from application logs and things like that. So having the flexibility to have our own data and take the burden of managing it ourselves is the route we've managed to take. So when I initially mentioned standards, I should be brutally honest and say that there is no real standard for playback metrics. That being said, there is one in the works. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The CTA R4 WG20 specification that is in draft right now is, in essence, trying to fix a lot of this issue, or a lot of these issues that I've mentioned. By no means is it going to be the end-all, be-all solution for everybody across the board, and it's been recognized that it won't be. But what's been recognized is that it can lay out the solid foundation for people to build off of. When we're building off events and structure of video playback, one thing that, from a web perspective, is very evident is that there's a media events specification, events that come across when you're utilizing HTML5 video per se. And this gets you a long way there. It can provide information as to when video starts, video seeks, video ends. It does not necessarily provide clear understanding cross-platform, and the intricacies around that can be a little bit unwieldy. So there is not necessarily a unified way to just hook into the media event structure and utilize that for tracking, but it is getting better. A lot of video engineers have spent a lot of time complaining to browser engineers and talking specifically around unification around this. And in my opinion, their ears are very much open, and they have been able to inform us that they are working in that direction to create a better event specification to allow more unification between how implementations can work across browsers and across platforms. But again, we're just talking about web here, and if we want to be able to compare and contrast playback on an iOS, Android app, web, platforms, televisions, et cetera, then again, some of this kind of falls out or gets thrown out the window. So platform unification is extremely important. There's also going to be a long list of custom property allocation. And by that I mean what video they're watching. Do you create unique identifiers around your video? Do you want to have an idea around any product-related information sent with this information? Of course, none of this would be involved in the specification, but it's something that is extremely important to consider when building or utilizing some service to allocate playback metrics yourself. Timing is probably one of the most important ones that I found to be I guess you could refer to as the most headache-inducing. Timing is extremely important. Understanding the time it takes to start a video, understanding how long people are spending in rebuffers, or how long it takes them to seek when video is or isn't in a buffer is extremely important, but everybody has a different idea as to how to allocate time. Using startup time for an example, is it the time that the user selects the video to start? Is it the time that the computation to retrieve the first segment of video? Is that when the start time starts? everybody has preferences as to how they want to calculate this, and no one's right and no one's wrong. Again, it's very dependent on the circumstances at which you're building. But when you start having conversations with other people in the industry, vendors that are supplying software around this, there is always this weird disconnect that happens at a granular level around the definition and the specifics around how people are doing this, why they're doing this, and what kind of data it ends up leading to. Networking data is very similar to this, being able to truly understand what's going on the user's network, how much, what their download speed is, why rebuffer events are happening, and if they're related specifically to the client's network state. A lot of this can be allocated in some circumstance, but again, there's no unification in terms of how it's allocated across all platforms. And again, as I mentioned, custom properties are really, really important here because they'll really dictate how you can translate very high-level understanding of video into something that's relatable to your product. So I've kind of made some mention on this, but as an overview of how we deal with playback metrics at Vimeo, we have an in-house metrics solution that's built from the ground up. We chose to, again, build something ourselves. I can attest that it's no small task. It's something that we put a lot of effort and time into, and it's something that continually evolves over time. So it's not a one-and-done solution. We have a constantly evolving player or playback code base, and this can be across multiple platforms, different players, but I think it's a given to understand that these things never just cease to have continual additions, subtractions, changes to them. Being able to be resilient to this is extremely important and something that needs to be considered when especially retrieving data from playback metrics. As one day you could be calculating something with some level of accuracy down to the second, and maybe one day somebody decides to make a change that, no, we're going to start watching this down to the millisecond, and whether that changes or impacts how data is retrieved is extremely important to make aware of all parties that are interested in retrieving it. One of the ways we try to cope with this is really hard definitions around events and properties and the schema that is delivered within each event payload. So in essence, a lot of this just comes down to either documenting very clearly and keeping that documentation evolving, building schema registries that allow you to version each iteration of your schema and allow compliancy to be automatically detected and conditioned. However that may be, there are some circumstances where things might change and might change unexpectedly that need to be taken into account. So with that schema that we have, that property set that we utilize is constantly evolving as well, which is a very unique challenge. But again, one of the things that we really pride ourselves on, and I really pride my team's effort into working on playback metrics, is being able to provide data that has very much, it really focuses on ease of access. So with that, one of the most important things that comes with ease of access is the ability for high levels of usability. And not everybody's going to be able to answer their questions by writing complex SQL, like SQL queries. A lot of people don't want to learn new tools just to answer a quick question and have that burden that they won't get that question answered, or going to have to bother somebody else or utilize somebody else's time internally to get those answers. We spend as much time working on tooling and customized tooling for data retrieval as we do the data retrieval side itself. By doing so, we enable people to answer their own questions, thus saving them time, saving any of their colleagues time who they would eventually ask for this help as well, and also provide a mechanism to allow my colleagues to have much more insight into this current status of our product at any given time. If In the middle of the day, they had a random question pop into their head around, hey, what's the average startup time of people in Europe as opposed to people in North America? They should be able to answer that question, and if they can do it with certainty, and if tooling can provide that certainty because it removes the variables which could potentially lead to incorrect information being served, then we classify that as a win. So some of the problems that really dictate the value of playback metrics, in my opinion. As we all know, in the world of software engineering, issues always happen. And the more dependencies that we rely on to serve video, and I'm sure everybody has a good understanding of how complex video delivery structures can be, both between live and VOD, OTT, whatever venue you really are focusing on, things happen, and they might be related to changes that you made. They might be related to your dependencies, both internal and external, but nevertheless, they continue and they will always happen. Just because they're happening doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to be aware that they're happening. So visibility is very circumstantial depending on if you have alerts, anomaly detection, if you have dashboards in the office that people are continually paying attention to. That doesn't mean you're going to catch everything, but in my opinion, the more detail that you can provide yourself in metrics, the less circumstantial it can potentially be. So some of these examples, could really result from issue tickets being serviced to you from third-party or internal resources, customer support interfacing with my engineering team per se, or again, you have no one providing feedback, where you're completely self-reliant on the data you have, not only now but in the past, to be able to understand the sheer impact of any issue that you're trying to resolve. So, as I made mention earlier, playback metrics are really great for high-level review. Getting a sense of what the aggregate startup time for a group is relatively easy, especially if you have a clear definition of the properties that you would need to be able to surface that information. If we're surfacing geolocation and we're surfacing startup times with startup events, then we can aggregate those events together and get a clear understanding of how fast or how slow our startup time is in that specific area. We operate in a multi-CDN environment, so that's another level that we can take it down. We can say, what's the average startup time in this area between these two CDNs, and compare and contrast the value we're getting in working with these vendors. When digging into suspect areas, both with ongoing issues or any questions that you want to understand clear answers to, a lot of this digging can be extremely time-consuming. When I go and I speak to the idea of availability of data internally, I don't expect that everybody's a data scientist. I am not a data scientist myself. I thoroughly enjoy digging into the data, but I can fully attest that when it comes to really digging into data, there's people that can really expedite the process. Knowing when and where to cut your losses sometimes is extremely important, because again, it has that black hole effect where you can continue looking and you might get half an answer to a question, which will lead you to a new question, which you might be able to answer, but it doesn't fulfill your overarching question. And thus you continue down this rabbit hole of learning, but not necessarily fulfilling the answers to your question that will alleviate the issue at hand. One of the big contributing factors to this is that trustworthy data and trustworthy identifiers in data can be extremely hard to configure, especially once you start digging really deep. Being able to trust your data is extremely important, and setting it up in a way that becomes trustworthy is the only way to really accomplish that. So as I kind of mentioned, from our perspective, and I think this is familiar to a lot of products and businesses out there, we have many levels of metrics at a high level breakdown that really start impacting how we can look up data. So from our perspective, we're distributing live and VOD traffic over HLS, Dash, and progressive playback over multiple browsers, over multiple platforms. Aggregating all that data together is good, depending on what you're looking into, but identifying what level of that breakdown in that tree to follow is extremely important, again, in terms of time conservation. So on top of that, we also operate in a multi-CDN environment. So taking that first list and then multiplying it by how many CDNs you're working with, how many geographic locations that you're interested in looking up, how many ISPs that you might be targeting, again, platforms and devices, the list goes on and on. So realistically, we kind of have this issue where we have an issue represented by this circle, and depending on if, we could have an issue with startup time per se, as an example. We could break down this issue between maybe live and VOD. And that's two very distinct, different delivery types and different infrastructures that could be driving them. We could break that down at a very high level. And then maybe both of those are serviced by multi-CDN architectures. And being able to dig down and dig through this entire tree becomes extremely time-consuming, as I continually mention. Eventually you might find that issue and treat it as a needle in a haystack. But at that point, are playback metrics working for or against you? There might be other ways to be able to facilitate allocating that answer with more precision and less time. In a perfect world, we would love a flow that looks more like this, where we can identify as much as we can around the issue at hand, lay out all of our criteria, and have a solid understanding of how we log things, where we log things. I think this is really an important point to hit when referring to if you're using a third-party solution or an internally created solution. We have the benefit of understanding with a lot of detail how we're logging data and why we're logging data in specific circumstances, since we created the system that's logging it. So hopefully in a perfect world, not saying that this is always the case, but something that I try to do myself and my team as well is to lay out as much criteria around the issue at hand as we have up front, be able to create that list and all of those variables up front, identify with priority which one could potentially lead to answering the question with the most detail, and follow that path and hopefully find success at the end of that. Again, not necessarily always the reality of the situation, but something that we really strive for and allows us to take that deep breath before we start down that path and hopefully think a little bit harder around what path we want to take rather than just trying to follow the path of least resistance that's laid out in front of us. So here's an example. For simplicity's sake, I omitted adding any numerical values to any of these graphs. But here's an example of a 10-minute window of playback errors. And how we classify playback errors would be very different, I'm sure, from other people's perspectives. In its most simplistic fashion, we classify playback errors as something that happens during a playback session, and we classify startup errors as something very different. So this is a 10-minute window, and as you can see, this giant spike that happened. Coincidentally, this happened when I was creating the slides for this talk specifically, so it lended itself very well to this. But you look at this spike, and it may or may not have raised alerts, or may or may not have been caught by anomaly detection. That's circumstantial to how much effort you put into configuring all of this. But nevertheless, you can clearly see that something happened. And not only did something happen, that it sustained an elevated rate after it happened. So, you know, I know I omitted putting numerical values around this, but I can tell you that this is an issue, but it's one of those issues that the rates are relatively low, and you have that decision that you're presented with in terms of, hey, do I spend time digging into this? Am I going to spend the next hour digging into this? Maybe I will yield a result. And if I find out the answer to it, does it necessarily impact my product for the better? Does it make customers happy? Am I identifying an issue from a vendor? All of these things could be potential wins, but it's one of those things that you kind of have to make that almost executive decision in the moment. Again, this is a 10-minute window. So the sooner I can identify this issue, the sooner I could potentially resolve this. So taking all that into mind and looking at this, I want to be able to ask a question that can hopefully give me as much clarity as possible. One of the unique aspects of our platform at Vimeo is that we are an extremely embed-heavy playback platform. And by that I mean the vast majority of our content is not viewed on site. We provide a mechanism to allow people to embed video wherever they want with a player that is extremely customizable, with an API that is pretty robust and in-depth that allows people to do what they want with their platform and the video on their platform. So with that in mind, one of the first things and one of the first questions that I come across when I look at this is, I need to start breaking this down. And as you can see, the very first query that I broke this down on isolated that same graph in this manner. And that was specifically grouping by refer, being able to identify if one customer or one implementation of a player was the core contributor to this issue. And again, looking at the trends, looking at our historical trends, seeing an abrupt change that wasn't related to a release of our player or any releases of our code that would hopefully be annotated over top of the graph itself, would kind of give us the idea that maybe this wasn't related to anything that we did. Something happened from an external source, and quickly grouping this by refer, I was able to identify, and I mean, after looking at this and going and opening up a tool to write a quick query, and by query I mean literally just grouping the results by refer, as that's a property on our playback metrics, gave me the confidence that there was one contributor to this issue. That contributor, with that refer address, I could go to their website, I could see that their implementation was not necessarily working as expected. They were utilizing our API in a very unique manner that was something that we could easily reach out to them and say, hey, we're noticing you're having issues with this, here's some help, and we can be proactive with solving this issue and working with our customers, rather than just letting it sit and continue with this elevated rate. In reality, the end user had implemented our API with a lot of issues. I was encountering bad playback experience and effectively killing playback experiences for their users, and they were doing this in background video that was looping as a background element of their website. So everybody that came to their website was encountering this issue, thus we had a sustained elevated rate. So again, something that we were able to quickly identify. I could reach out to our customer support team, say, hey, this is the account that's using this and this is the issue that they're having. Probably best to reach out to them and provide a mechanism that we can provide more insight as to how to do what they want to do with our product. Something very simple like that I think is extremely important, and not necessarily just ignoring that there's going to be bad usage, but being proactive again with any issues that we can quickly identify. Not only helps our product succeed, but in turn helps other businesses and their products succeed that are depending on our product. So some of the contributors to the quick resolution there was really understanding product impact, understanding what we log, how we log it, how people are utilizing our product, helps me quickly understand and create that prioritized list of action items that I really want to work down from the top to the bottom. Again, on and off site embeds, API usage, player customizations are kind of some of the unique burdens that we have to deal with in terms of identifying core contributors to these issues. And the more customization or control you give to your end users, inherently, the wider that spectrum tends to get. Understanding your ecosystem and the products that we offer continually helps us as well. Again, the first and foremost, the one thing that I quickly looked at is understanding that probably because there was no changes in our site deploys at that moment in time, it was more than likely off-site usage. Now, that's not a guarantee, but again, looking at it from priority sequence, it allows me to work down that prioritized list and hopefully yield a meaningful answer as quick as possible. Delivery, content types, playback configurations, all these things are worth keeping into consideration. And as video delivery and video delivery infrastructures become more and more complex, this issue or this fact, it becomes more and more important. The complexity will continue to grow. The video will continue to get bigger, and more people will consume it in manners that they prefer to consume it in. Working in this industry, we try to provide those mechanisms with as much resiliency and highest quality of service that we can. But again, that spectrum gets wider in terms of edge cases that can be hit. And trusting in your data is extremely important, because without trusting in your data, that anomaly could be related to somebody opening something up in a unique circumstance that wasn't an issue. And again, that's the black hole effect, where if you don't have that trust, you're just opening yourself up to more edge cases that don't yield results or actionable work. And the way you make trust in your data, in my opinion, is to make your data more trustworthy. And again, that's something that we put a lot of effort into, understanding how we allocate information from different platforms and devices, what those platforms and devices are yielding, and trying to find ways to create some level of unification, be it on the request or after the request, really helps us maintain that trust. And with all of this, you can build that prioritization list and work from the top to the bottom, and hopefully spend the most minimal amount of time to get the most bang for your buck, per se. Some of the top concerns, again, I've made a lot of mention of this, but I really have to stress the time you spend in identifying issues is key. If you're spending a copious amount of time trying to identify issue number 1, chances are issue number 2 might roll right in at the exact same time, and to deal with that level of concurrency as continually feedback is coming in, positive, negative product changes are coming in, more releases, more changes. The time to spend identifying issues is extremely important. False positives are extremely cumbersome. You can put anomaly detection, you can put alerting on this. People don't consume video the same way every day, all day, everywhere in the world. Understanding those ebbs and flows and dealing with the burden of false positives is an issue that we're continually trying to engineer ourselves out of. There's no necessarily, at least from my opinion, no clear definition as how we can resolve that. But again, being able to check off a lot of these other points that I've made helps us hopefully be able to minimize the amount of false positives that we get, because again, the top concern here is really around time. Misreporting is something that we try to avoid as much as possible, but it's inevitably going to happen. Things can be calculated incorrectly. New platforms can come out. New devices can come out. That could lead you to circumstances that all of a sudden you're seeing inflated rates, but it's not necessarily true. That could be good, that could be bad. It can give you the tap on the shoulder to identify, hey, maybe we see this impact, we should go and put some effort into engineering some better solutions for these platforms. That could be one of a million different circumstances to be put in, but again, being able to trust your data and minimize the amount of misreporting or identify when misreporting is happening because of the trust in your data, I think is extremely important. Over-reliance in playback metrics is something I hit on very early on. I have to stress, I really think of playback metrics as just one tool in a toolbox. Being able to utilize the insight that we allocate from playback metrics with other data points, with backend logs, with application logs, with CDN logs, having the freedom to be able to do that is what I think really makes this tool valuable. And understanding the limitations, and that's very circumstantial on your product, on your business, in my opinion. But understanding those, I think, will really help you be able to create validity of this tool. So here's another quick example. One of the things that we like to do is to be able to not only have clear, raw information from our playback sessions, but also create better ways to aggregate data as well. You'll see a lot of third-party vendors do this, and some of them do it very well. But being able to create some level of scoring around your playback sessions, then you can compare and contrast different CDNs, different delivery types together or against each other. This is an example where we're looking at 3 different CDNs. And in a perfect world, they would all be operating relatively the same. And you can see historically they were, and then one started to continually drop off. This is, as you can see right here, this is something that, again, we've put in a level of math to score these sessions. Is this something that we're incorrectly reporting and surfacing to ourselves? Is this actually degraded performance of the CDN? I can attest that when time is critical, going to your vendors and just saying, hey, something's not working and here's the graph I have to show you. I have no other insight other than the scores on an aggregate level of playback on your CDN are not what they used to be, and they're lower than the other CDNs I use. Is not necessarily going to yield a very quick result majority of the time, unless your vendor says, yes, there is an issue going on, which hopefully they're more resilient to. So being able to identify responsibility, avoiding the core issues, avoid hiding the core issues, and being able to provide insight. Again, that level of insight I was showing you there was from a scored perspective. As we can see from that score, one CDN is operating differently. So it's really a key indicator to me that I need to only focus my insight on that one CDN. And then understanding how we do score things. If we're scoring things from 3 different data points or a multitude of data points, understanding what those data points are and how to break those down for that specific CDN will hopefully give us more insight to be able to either fix this issue ourselves or, again, go back and converse with our vendors to be able to provide them with the insight that we've obtained so that hopefully they can correct the issue as well. Yeah, and so delivery types, regions, contents, all are contributing factors here. And again, that one CDN that we saw with degraded performance could be serving segmented content, progressive content, live content. So being able to identify those key contributors will be as informative to you as it could be to your vendors that you may be communicating with after the fact. Utilizing secondary resources, again, I've made mention of this in terms of only treating this as one of many tools, but being able to take this and say, hey, we've seen degraded performance over this CDN. Now I'm going to go and take the logs from that CDN. Hopefully you can get them as quickly as you've been able to allocate your playback metrics and utilize those, and hopefully you've been able to tick 2 boxes in terms of understanding what the impact was. If they differ, then that's a different question to answer than if they're unified. But being able to take data from one place and take it from another place and really cross-validate each other is something that's extremely important. And then I quickly want to touch on this because in a multi-CDN architecture, when we see degraded performance like that and we have data availability across multiple CDNs, one course of action could be, hey, I'm going to shut off that CDN right now. And I don't even know what the issue is, but when we're talking about seconds matter, I could quickly just start diverting all of the traffic onto a healthy CDN that was not showing that degraded performance. That's a slippery slope in my opinion. Not only are you going to push a lot of traffic onto a CDN that might not be configured or expecting it, and they would see a lot of elevated data throughput that may or may not be extremely expensive and extremely impactful to the delivery. But you might just be putting a Band-Aid over the issue. And who's to say that when you re-enable that traffic to that old CDN that it doesn't sustain the same rates? So being able to identify when and where you use a Band-Aid more than spending the time to say, hey, this is degraded performance, but I haven't proven to myself, I haven't seen any customer support tickets, I don't necessarily know with certainty that this is actually negatively impacting the QoE of people's playback is extremely important. As I've talked about, scoring playback sessions, there's cons. There's no standardized formula to doing this. The way that you do it is your own. The way that third-party vendors do it is their own. Formulas can misinterpret a lot of quality of experience. Depending on what's important to you, you might make that part of the criteria as to what you're looking into. You may not. You can really hide low-level issues because of this. You're looking at a very high-level perspective when you start scoring things, moreover, when you're aggregating those scores, so it's something to be savvy to. But from a pro's perspective, there's the overview of system health can be extremely helpful. You can create dashboards for startup time, rebuffer rates, abandonment, exits before starts, whatever metrics that are extremely key to your business success. You can aggregate a lot of these together and start looking at them on one graph maybe. And by doing so, you can get a better sense of health and not necessarily have to keep your eyes on a whole bunch of different areas at once, which in turn can provide that nudge on the shoulder, that tap on the back when it's needed. It's up to you as to how you want to dig into it and make it actionable work. So with that, you have an easily monitored metric, which would give you a lot of insight. And you can utilize this in breakdowns, right? So I could show me the score of this CDN against this CDN, show me scores for Europe versus Asia. Being able to look at that is just another metric that allows you to break things down and do comparative analysis between two groups. So I think this is a kind of a unique example of a circumstance where we were using scoring to really understand impact of delivery to a specific region for a specific CDN for a specific data type. And being able to plot bad scores, the spectrum of scoring on a map quickly started to reveal that, hey, there's one really suspect area here in the wide range of circumstances and areas that people were looking at data, having playback sessions, and we quickly identified that, hey, this one ISP is not playing nice with this specific CDN, and there's a huge group of people in this geographic area that are having a lackluster time trying to consume video content. So when it comes to that, maybe it is more beneficial to say people in this general area can start pushing their data over to another CDN, pending that infrastructure is set up, pending you have edges close enough to them to make it work. But I think this is a great example of showing how you can take something as simplistic as a score and being able to plot it on a map and being able to quickly identify a suspect area. One of my last examples here is comparing two different test groups against one another. And this is another graph without any numeric values, but there's an elevated rate here in terms of rebuffer ratios of live consumed video content. You can see prior to this page, or on the left side of this page, things were much more closely unified, and then they started to separate, and then there was a sharp escalation of the issue. We were able to utilize our internal tools. One of them look somewhat like this, where we're able to look at data down to the session and identify, hey, I want to look at a session that was in that group of bad experiences and look at the data for that specific session, or look at a whole bunch of sessions in that group and see if there's anything that was similar between them. We ended up identifying a very unique issue only through playback metrics, surprisingly enough, that was about segment availability and having issues delivering segments in time in a very unique circumstance of a very unique configuration of an A/B test of a live infrastructure backend. So the issue was we were not delivering segments in time. In turn, when video is continually refreshing manifests and segments aren't there, the player can easily just get stumbled up and say, oh, well, there's no segment there. I'll try again in the next interval, and the segment will be there. Eventually, you're going to incur enough offset that you're going to have a rebuffer event. And you'll start seeing these rebuffer events on very unique intervals that were very much alike between a lot of the sessions we started looking at. So without going down to the session level and having tools around this to quickly identify this, we would have spent a lot of time digging into this and figure out exactly what the case scenario was, because there was a lot of criteria that led up to how this was impacted. I just wanted to quickly touch on how important it was to look down at the session level there and ignore the high level, but being able to group the high level into two separate groups and then be able to identify similarities between each session in the bad group. And that really came down to having our own tooling around this, or else we would be writing many queries and looking at just tabular data that may or may not be able to quickly visualize what the issue was. And we were able to resolve the issue and do so with minimal impact. So a quick recap over what we've talked about here. Playback metrics are extremely useful, and I will fully attest to this as somebody who uses them on a daily basis. But they can be extremely time-consuming, and it's something that is always a trade-off that I consider every time I spend time digging into this or looking into issues or just checking the well-being of our platform. High-level monitoring provides you a small window, and understanding your ecosystem is really key to be able to identify what that window should look like and how you should look at things to not burden yourself with the amount of time spent, but continually give yourself that reassurance that things are working to their expectation. A lot of what we pride ourselves on in terms of creating these circumstances, again, is the time we spend into building tooling and continually evolving tooling. Whenever we see or identify a gap in terms of how we can allocate data or an area that we wish we could allocate data in a better way, we try not to dwell on these. We try to make those actionable items. If you needed something that you didn't have, then let's figure out a way to put that on the roadmap to build that out, because unless it's very, very circumstantial, somebody else will have the same question in another day in the near future. So fixing the problems rather than talking about them over a long period of time generally will yield a better tool set over the long term. And as I touched on at the very start, standardization is really going to help a lot of this and create more unity around how people talk around this, how people can create more unified solutions between companies, across platforms, and how we converse around these things. Because I think, again, without having a clear identifier or clear documentation as to how people do it, a lot of people just avoid talking about it because it's to each their own, and it's kind of a battle each business fights on their own right. So finally, next steps, better feedback loops, human and automated, continually getting better, and something to continually work on. Minimizing false positives, avoiding overcomplication, grow internal tooling and availability. I can't stress enough. If you have any interest in really diving into this, the specification that I made mention of will be available on this GitHub address, and I can share this with anybody that needs it. Feel free to take a photo of it. You can also search for it. They're referring to it as an OTT video playback metrics specification, and it'll be soon available on this GitHub address for public consumption and feedback. So if you feel like this could be beneficial to you, like weigh in now, because it will really dictate how this manifests itself to the public in the future. And that's all I got for today. Thank you very much.